welcome to this special discussion on peasant movement in India. India traditionally has been a country of varieties of social movements, may it be the tribal movement, workers movement, youth movement, women's movement, environmental movement, peasant movement, and so many other kind of movements taking place in all parts of the country. In today's discussion, we shall be focusing on peasant movement in India. Before we go to that, first we will be narrating what do you understand by social movement. It is quite important that at the very outset, we should talk about social movement and its dynamic. Then we will be talking about the peasant society and its dynamics of peasant movement, specifically focusing in the Indian context. So let us begin with what do you understand by social movement. Usually social movement are taken into consideration an exceptional, episodic, a special kind of manifestation of outrage of the people in the society. It is not. Social movement, rather, these are social, because this is social movement. We are not talking about the social anti-movement. It is a movement that generated out of people's desire to live in the society. It lies as fire in the heart of the society, and it is like any other normal social phenomenon, but it is very explicit and expressive in its content. That's why many of the reputed social scientists talk about society flows in its own course, and fire of movement lies within its own course to speak the truth and direction of the society in its own course. It is widely talked about the social movement as the prophet of the present, because it predicts what is going to take place in our future society, what should be the direction and form of the future society that comes in terms of the direction given by social movement. It is the social movement, part of social progression, that gives new thoughts, new ideas for action, new ideas for social policy, and new ideas for implementation of the same. So by saying so, what I am trying to speak that social movement are not social anomalies. These are the ideas for the big change in the society. These are ideas for a new change in the society. These are ideas for transformation in the society, and it speaks about justice, equality, and fraternity. And justice, fraternity, and equality is to be defined by the participant of a movement, those who are the flag bearer of change and transformation in the society. So our intention here to categorize social movement from that of a mob. You will be finding that is in society there are so many mob attacks, that is people gathered together and started expressing their dissent without having immediate leadership, without having immediate organizational capability, and it is not sustaining and not sustainable. So those are the mob, those are the faceless categories. But when we talk about social movement, we talk about a social movement which is organized from within, which is organized from above, which is organized with the participation of the people. And this is not individual. Social movement are the collective phenomenon. It's the collective efforts of the people. So when we are talking about a social movement, we have to keep in mind, we are not talking about the mob behavior. We are talking about an organized social behavior, an organized social effort to bring about the thought, to bring about change in the thought, in the belief, in the values, in the attitude, in the relationship, in the major institutional arrangement of the society. So it is not only to bring change, there can also be a social movement to resist those changes, to resist the changes in the thoughts, in the beliefs, the values, attitude, relationship, and other institutional arrangement of the society. So what we are trying to emphasize is that social movement is a change agent. It is trying to bring a change in the society by bringing change in the thoughts, beliefs, action, and social relationship in the social and institutional arrangement, or resist change in those areas. By saying so, we have to underline certain important factor is that social movement should have an organization. No social movement takes place without an organization. If it is not having an organization, it can't be a movement because it's not sustaining, it's not sustainable, because a mob can't be a social movement. Mob is not based on certain organization. It's a kind of a momentary outburst of people anger, momentary outburst of people desire, momentary outburst of people aspiration. Those are not guided by any organizational setup. So what is important is that a social movement should have an organization that should speak about its wider spectrum. The spectrum is that it should have a leadership. Without having leadership, no social movement can go, because there may be millions of supporters of a movement, but who will articulate the policy? What will be the, how there will be interest articulation? How there will be summation of interest of the people? How the desire of the people will be expressed in front of the authorities or in front of the opponents, those who are opposing the movement. So there is a role of a leader in social movement. So first is the organization, second part is the leadership. Leadership is an important component of social movement. Third important component is that if social movement is to be sustaining, it should have an ideology. What is an ideology? Ideology gives legitimacy to the action, legitimacy for certain organization, legitimacy to carry out certain futuristic perspective. So it is the ideology that gives a wider worldview of a movement. So third important component we talked about beside organization and leadership, that is the ideology. Third important part is that social movement should be founded on collective mobilization. So no social movement can sustain for long without having a sustainable collective mobilization. So if a social movement is there, it is to carry on, it is to show its mobilization from one stage to another. So mobilization should be there. Third is that interest articulation. That is the fifth. Fifth is the important interest articulation. That is a social movement organization and leadership should articulate the interest of the followers, because we may have the social movement activist, social movement participant, social movement sympathizer, social movement opponents, but those who are the social movement participant and sympathizers, they want to know what are the interests they are articulating, whether they can be part with that interest. So it should be summation of the interest that should be expressed through the leadership and the organization. The interest articulation is the important component. Then is that all social movements should have an identity. It is the identity is what we are. So it should talk about the what kind of identity they are constructing, whether those identities are constructed in terms of local forces, those identities are constructed in terms of wider forces, whether those identities are constructed in terms of caste, ethnicity, religion, whether those identities are constructed in terms of nationality. So all those thing comes in the way identity is constructed in a social movement. So wider the construction of an identity, wider is the spread of a social movement, and wider is the possibility of its sustenance. And third important component is that a social movement not only brings about change, and it also undergoes changes and transformation over a period of time. So whatsoever we are talking about, the first component of social movement is the organization, second is the leadership, third is the ideology, fourth is the collective mobilization, fifth is the interest articulation, sixth is identity formation, seventh is the change and transformation. So when we are talking about some of the basic features of social movement, change and transformation, let us talk about that is what is the linkage of social movement with social transformation. It is that every social movement is having a life history. It grows like a baby, it acquires a kind of maturity, and also it goes a process of transformation. So what we find, that is, there is a process of nurturing period, acquiring the peak, then the anti-peak of a social movement. But in the process of acquiring all those phases, there is a possibility that a social movement will bring change not only in the society, social movement also bring change to itself. At times, a social movement become changes itself to become a political party. When a social movement becomes a political party, it ceases to be a social movement, it becomes part of an establishment. So that is one phenomenon. So what we find besides that also, when this is transforming, we find a social movement may be a revolutionary social movement, it may be transformed into a quasi-movement. What is a revolutionary social movement? Those who are talking about the far-wide change in the institutional social fabric in the society, but gradually those things are achieved. A social movement become a quasi-movement because it looks about only a change in the limited dimensions of the society. So you can see a kind of a transformation of the social movement from a revolutionary to a quasi-movement. Then you find another transformation of social movement, that is social movement that take birth as a radical social movement. What of this radical? It is talking about immediate change. Ignores that values, norm and culture and society, sudden outburst of organized action, and it is a sudden, but it remains only for a limited period of time. But the radical movements also gradually get transformed into a reformative movement. So there is a possibility of gradual transformation of a radical movement into a reformative movement. We also will be talking about how various social movements, those are the old social movement, gradually getting transformed into a new social movement. So old and new social movement, we will be talking a little later. It is not in terms of chronology, in terms of the certain component. In terms of certain component, those components are getting transformed over a period of time from old to a new social movement. Now come to this, certain kind of a intersectionality, that is, we need not consider that those radical, reformative, quasi, and revolutionary, those need not be contradictory to each other. Over a period of time, one may be complementary to another, because one social movement, based on collective mobilization, that collective mobilization paves the way for further arousal of consciousness, arousal of other interest articulation in the society. So one radical movement paves the way for the emergence of varieties of other reformative social movement. That's why we find that process of mobilization and institutionalization may coexist within the movement itself. And when this thing coexists, we find there is a possibility of new areas of social movement that keep on taking place. So we'll be talking about those issues later, how a radical movement get institutionalized, how the new institutionalized movement paves the way or creates the possibilities of further mobilization in the society. And at this stage, let us go one step further, that is how social movements are perceived in the society by social scientists in general and policy framers, the leaders on the other. Social movements, because since it questions the established arrangement of the society, not always, but at times, it questions the established arrangement. Our functionalist scholar, those who widely talked about in terms of systemic integration, system adherence, systemic coherence, they considered social movement are the disruptive arrangement. They bring disruption to the social order, that the dysfunctional. So social movement functionalists mostly, except a few, mostly they avoided talking about social movement because these are the disruption that brings disruption in the social order. Then we find another group of social scholars, those are the Marxist social scholars. They recognize social movement to be a social phenomenon, but they have followed the deductive logic that all social movement are the class movement. So all social conflict are the class conflict. So it is a kind of a deductive approach, and through the deductive approach, the possibilities of emergence of other kind of social identity rather than the class identity, class interest, are not explicitly available within the Marxian discourse. So what we find, there's a limitation in Marxian analysis of social movement, also limitation in the functionalist analysis of social movement. What we find, the social movement also widely there is the collective behavior perspective. Our scholars, those who are believing the collective behavior, they accepted even it's a kind of a social phenomenon, but it's a non-institutionalized social phenomenon. They accepted that collective behavior may be of two forms. One may be in institutionalized form, other may be uninstitutionalized. So they accepted it. It is a phenomenon, but non-institutionalized phenomenon. But it is for the first time the symbolic interactionalists like Debal and many other, what they started talking about, that is social movement. It creates a space of creativity, a space of arrival for the new in the society. So there is a possibility that through social movement, through the articulation of new interest, through the articulation of the new dream, there is the possibility of arrival of a new social framework in the society. So they found the arrival of something new in the social order. So what we find, that is looking all those things, another step further, that is there have been a dominant perspective, two dominant perspective in social movement theory. One is that resource mobilization perspective. This is widely emerged in North America. They talked about the democratic framework in the society that has emerged with the arrival of the welfare state, that has given the space for the creation of politics within the state order. That politics not only takes place within the state order through the parliamentary election, it also creates the space of varieties of the trade unions and other stakeholders of the society for the articulation of the interests. So what they are talking about, there is a possibility of articulation of interest by the people, and that interest is articulated very rationally in terms of cost and benefit. So social movement is a phenomenon that is emerging out of a democratic space that is created by the state, the welfare state. Within that people participate. How they participate? They participate in terms of their rationality of action, that is, if I participate, what I will get in back. So it is a kind of a rational calculation in terms of one's participation in the movement. It is also talking about not only the people, social movement also created by the political entrepreneurs. How they created demand of conflict. There is a conflicting situation, a counter-conflicting situation is created. So there are a category of the political entrepreneurs. They create the demand, they create the possibility of alternative mobilization through a social movement, propagate, sustains with the rationality of human action. So what they are talking also simultaneously, there is political opportunities available, and within these political opportunities, there is a possibility of liberation of human cognition. What they are talking about, when somebody is constructing a conflict, by constructing a conflict, they are creating a phenomena, what they call contentious politics. By constructing, you are liberating your cognition, you are liberating your thought process, and you are contributing to the process of social framing. And within this social framing, you are constructing the world that is to be. If you are constructing a world that is to be, what you try to do, you try to be very selective in your word, in your punctuation, in your word, so that it can motivate the people in the articulation of the interest. You create an imaginary world. In this imaginary world, there is a demand, there is a supply, and those are done by the entrepreneurs, taking cognizance of the rational behavior of the human being, what I will get if I participate. So it is widely talked about in terms of political phenomenon that is available in North American countries and North American social science perspective. There has also been wide talked about social movement in terms of identity perspective, what you call the new social movement perspective. What is the identity perspective? It is talking about that is, even the welfare state is the framework, and within the welfare state there has been preponderance of labor movement, there has been wide manifestation of varieties of these activities, and all social groups within that space are interacting for the realization of the historicity, that is a self-conscious awareness to liberate one collective identity. And so what they find here, in earlier case of resource mobilization perspective, one's participation was guided by one interest. Here, one's participation is widely conditioned by one's subjectivity, one idealism, and one morality. So it is not only talking in terms of your interest, it is beyond your interest, because you are participating for certain cause. When you are participating in a national movement, you are guided by subjectivity, you are guided by idealism. When you are participating in the environmental movement, you are participating in the human rights movement, women's movement. So what you find enormously conditioned by certain subjectivity and certain idealism, a kind of a liberation. You look for the space within the historical condition of the society. So what it is talking about, it is kind of new kind of identities. What is the new kind of identities? Earlier case, we found the Marxian identities created identity in terms of only class. The American perspective, that is resource mobilization or political process perspective, this created a category in terms of occupational interest or a professional interest. Here we find a new kind of identities. Those are constructed with the intersectionality of global, local linkages in terms of the concern for globality, humanity, humanitarianism, environment, gender, the farmer, the peasants and other. And these are widely founded not on economic conditioning, but in terms of certain social mooring, social norms and values. So it is a response of certain identities, certain collectivities, following the non-violence means to acquire, to make a society an ideal place to live, where subjectivity, idealism will be the precondition in people's survival. So protest comes in. The protest is founded on subjectivity, idealism and morality. What we find when now the social movement across the globe is taking place, so social movement has not remained social movement a local phenomenon. We find the social movement, those who have grown in terms of civil liberties movement in America, or the anti-black movement in America, that has spread across the world. What we find, the farmers movement or the peasant movement in India, it has been part of a global movement. Environmental movement taking place in India, part of the global movement. So are the women's movement. So we find there has been a proliferation of movement at a global level, what we call in terms of movements of movement. That is, so many movements are articulating in one place and getting linked widely. So it is creating a phenomenon of a social movement society in which individual identities are getting misplaced by a global identity. Everybody is becoming part of a movement society, speaking in terms of equality, fraternity and justice, and here you stand. But simultaneously within this process, there is a, while we are talking about a process of liberating mechanism, liberating phenomenon, there has also emergence of coercive phenomenon. What are those coercive phenomena? There has also been within this formation of global social movement, there has been construction of abstract identity, essence and symbol that speaks in terms of only purity and homogeneity, that champion only the absolute and accept the attitude to do and die, and they don't allow the space for the growth of free discussion. So it's a kind of a hegemonic movement. What you talk it in terms of extremist movement that talks about the absolute, and that destroyed the scape of the whole space for social movement. That is, and also rather they fight against the social movement that speak for the liberty, fraternity and justice. So what Vavikra and other widely talked about, the contemporary world has also been marked by the proliferation of social anti-movement. That is, these are not the movement, they are the social anti-movement that squeezes the space for the liberation in terms of citizenship, in terms of other available instrument of empowerment of people in the society. So what we find, these are the white framework. That is white framework, that is, we are talking about a social movement and organized activities. That organized activities are widely conditioned by interest on the one hand, identity on the other. That is also widely conditioned by, in terms of proliferation of social movement and social anti-movement. And if that is the phenomenon, the question remains, how do you like to see the proliferation of peasant movement within it? What is the nature of a social peasant movement? How it gets transformed and how it evolves, and what are the ramifications for the wider society? Before going that, let us briefly talk about what do we understand by peasant in our society, in a vocabulary, is a conventional academic vocabulary. Usually when you are talking about peasant, we usually take into consideration that is peasant are a category of the people, those who are attached to the land to eke out their livelihood. By eking out livelihood, we are emphasizing on this phenomenon because they are attached to the land in different capacities. They are attached to the land to eke out their livelihood, not to make profit. Because they are having no, not making profit is not a sin, but what is that they are not having the capacity to make the profit. So ultimately what they do, peasants usually they are the economically, socially and politically marginalized group and provide the basis for large scale mass mobilization in the society. If that is a peasant social category, how do you like to conceptualize peasant in Indian society? Let us come to an empirical phenomenon. Empirical phenomenon is that peasant in India represent a vast mass of the landless agricultural laborer, the sharecroppers, the tenant, the poor artisans, the small and marginal cultivators who work on land to eke out their livelihood primarily from agriculture by their own labor. Keep in mind what is important is that as a category they are laborer, they are sharecroppers, they are the tenant, they are the poor artisans, they may be the small and marginal cultivators, but they are only predominantly working on the land to eke out their livelihood for their livelihood sustenance. They are having no capacity to work on land, to generate surplus or to make profit by engaging themselves. Second part is that they work on land by engaging their own labor. They are having no capacity to hire other labor. So what we found, that is labor, they are mostly in Indian society, they are the semi-landless and the marginal landholding categories. They are the marginal workers. They mostly predominantly remain or underemployed in the rural areas. They experience the problem of unemployment in the rural areas, seasonal employment, also gender-based wage segregation. You may be knowing in the rural area, though it is widely eradicated, conventionally women are paid lesser wages than the male folk in the society, in the rural workforce. But what we find, a vast section of the this peasant belong to the category of poverty-ridden people. They belong to the below poverty line, and as their productive from the land is very low. So what we find, the whole element of marginality is reinforced on the peasantry. When you are using the term marginality, sociologically we should be very careful. That is, we are talking peasant as a marginal category. As a marginal category, we means when you talk about a marginal category, number one, they are deprived of, they suffer from the element of economic, social and political denial in the society. The denial in terms of access to the productive resources, less access to the political power, less access to the social hierarchy, higher status, and they remain mostly political underdogs. So, and they also remain culturally some people an outsider from within. They are a part society and part culture. So they are the marginalized people. When the marginalized people not only denied, they are also reproduced in the society through the process of socialization, reproduction of inequality in the society. And another important part is that marginalized people, being marginalized, living in the lower rung of the society, inherit the potential of collective mobilization in the society. So they are the epitome of, many a time they have remained the epitome of deviant social behavior, the epitome of social revolt, and also they are the participant, the active participant in the peasant movement. In saying so, let us talk about the peasant movement in India, how it has taken place and the kind of participation they have taken in Indian society. India has been, as I have told, that it has been a land of agriculture, and agrarian inequality has been part of the Indian heritage since the days of colonial rule in India. So India has seen the vehement peasant movement even during independence struggle. We found the peasant movement, the Chandi Chora movement, the Bardole movement. Then we found the enormous tribal movement. So we find all those movement, wide participation of the peasant under Gandhi's leadership. Then immediately after independence, we found that discontent, those who were growing in the agrarian society in India, those were manifested in the form of Teghava movement that took place 1946-47 in undivided Bengal. Telangana movement took place in 1948 and 52 in Andhra Pradesh. The Naxalite movement took place in 1969-72 again in Bengal. Singur movement in Bengal, and varieties of the peasant movement, it has taken place in all parts of the country. So what we found, that is, peasant movement has proliferated in many parts of this country, and there have been participation of the poor peasant, those precisely from the scheduled tribe, scheduled caste and other background. Now let us come, just for example, what is the basic cause, why the peasant participate in the peasant movement, how this movement sustained over a period of time. The Tevaga movement took place because it was with the main slogan was that land to the tillers. Why the land to the tillers? Because the land, those who were possessed by the land, gradually those land got transferred to the intermediary landowners, and the small landowners become either the sharecroppers or the tenant in the same piece of land or the agricultural laborer, and they are cultivating, getting only 50% of the produce. And there was a report even by Bengal Famine Commission in 1939 that 1/3 of the share to be given to the Tevaga, that is 1/3 of the share to be given. So what they started talking about through this movement, that instead of 1/3, they should be given 2/3 of the share. That is more than, they should be given 66% of the produce rather than 50% of the produce which was traditionally given to them. So they revolted for that, and there was combined opposition both by the state and the administration, and that movement collapsed. And but whatsoever the idea generated out of this movement, that was integrated in the land reform policy of Government of India 1952. That is, land ceiling was introduced, then tenancy reform was introduced, and no eviction of the sharecropper was a provision within that. So what we find that whatsoever the idea generated out of a movement, that has been matter of public policy and administration at the later stage. Whether those are implemented or not, if those are not implemented, what kind of social reaction has been towards it? That has been another phenomenon, another research question that is dealt with by the researcher. So what we find, one movement has created the space for this another movement, and these movements were widely sustained for a longer period of time. And this movement, what happened, these are mostly a radical social movement, and this radical social movement, in that way, it challenged the established rules and law of the country. And a major participant in those movements are the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the scheduled caste woman and the tribal woman. And then we find a lot of they are widely guided by sense of economic security, and since they are guided by the economic insecurity, they followed the political path of collective mobilization to bring a kind of greater economic share for them. So what we find, that is, that movement continued, but gradually similar kind of radical movement also took place in the Telangana movement, and then we find similar radical movement took place in the Naxalbari movement. But gradually those movements got transformed into radical to institutionalized movement. At this stage, let us go talk about some phenomenon of this radical and reformative social movement. When we talk about a radical peasant movement, a radical movement having specific goal. They are hostile against the institution, norms, and they look for structural change and look for egalitarianism. Let us explain it a little bit. That is, there have a very specific goal. They don't go for the wider goal. What is the radical goal for the Telangana movement? It was the Tevaga movement. It was like this: land to the tiller. Okay, the sharecroppers be given 2/3 of the share. That was a very specific goal. And then it came to the another phase that is very hostile against the institution. It was hostile against the state. It was hostile against the landowner, and their hostility was reflected in terms of their hostile action against the state. And they were against the established norms, values, and moorings. And so what they did, they revolted against the landowners. They took arms in their hand. And what they asked for? They asked for a big structural change in the society. What is the structural change? The land to the tiller. Land was belonging to the big landowners. No, land should come to the tiller. Those who are owning the land, it should come to the land. So demand articulation, interest articulation was the part of that. They also give the framework, radical movement and egalitarianism. Let us look into how the reformative movement look into that. Reformative movement is having a diverse goal. They will talk about the simultaneously interest of the sharecroppers, agricultural laborer, poor farmers differently, and their hostility will be guided. It will not be as guideless hostility. It is totally within the given parameters, and these will be adhered to certain norms and values and reformative arrangement of the society. And second important part is that it is only single ideology, and it is a secret organization. What we find, it is a multiple ideology. That is, reformative, it is not only one organization is moving, giving leadership to the movement. There are multiple organizations. We find there is a proliferation of several political organizations started giving leadership to this movement. So earlier it is a secret organization. In that case, we find the open organization. Now, the radical movement try to see most of the participants to be the change agent, but in that case, the reformative movement, they try to see everybody to be the beneficiaries, because you want to take part, you will get benefits. In other cases, you are the change agent, you are changing yourself, you are also bringing change to the society. Then radical movement widely get opposition from the state and at time of the civil society, but here radical movement, institutionalized, the reformative movement, many times these are sponsored by the state. Take into consideration the whole issue of empowerment of women, the issue of empowerment of the agricultural laborer and sharecroppers. So these are part of the state reformative package, and they go for mobilization of the peasant sharecroppers, so the Panchayati Raj institutions. Now what is happening, another part is that radical movement usually revolt against the dependency and domination, but in the reformative movement, within the structure of dependency and domination is inculcated, but many of these poor peasants may be emerged to be dependent on so many brokers and intermediaries within the society. So what you find that the trend of mobilization, which starts with the radical peasant movement, over a period of time it may become reformative. When becoming reformative, it brings lot of alteration in the basic feature of the social movement. What are those basic features? That is, we talked about being change in its organization, being change in the leadership, it brings changes in its ideology, it brings changes in its mobilization pattern, in its interest articulation, in its own idea and relationship with the state and other agencies. So it goes the whole process of transformation within the society, within the social movement culture. Now, what is happening? Now we find that interest articulation of peasant in the society, now it is having multifaceted interest articulation with varieties of new agencies, those are working in the society. How this interest articulated? We find that interest articulation of the peasants are now taking place through the peasants and the organized political parties for the distribution of the development scheme. And what we find is the peasants get polarized in terms of their affiliation of particular political parties and affiliation to the panchayat, so that they can be the beneficiaries. So what we find, new agencies have come to give direction to the peasant as a social group. Those were the marginalized group in the society. Now what we find that peasants, when they are participating through the panchayat and political party, there is every possibilities, that is the peasants' ideas and interest are get co-opted by the political parties and also by the civil society and other stakeholders. So there is a possibility that whom we are aspiring or thinking, we means the peasants are thought of to be the change agent, and the intelligentsia tried to describe them as a change agent. They find them to be a dependent category. They are a co-opted category, co-opted by the political parties in the civil society. Now we find another change in the whole framework. The framework change comes in terms of leadership. Peasant society usually don't get the leadership, usually, not always, usually leadership from within. They get the leadership from the middle class or the urbanites. So when they are getting leadership from the urbanites, the dependency on the urbanites remain apart. So it is many times the leadership does not arise from within, rather they remain dependent on the arrival of the leadership from the outside. But this is not the typical case. There may be so many leadership now have started coming from the within. Now we find that is there is a multiplicity of proliferation of peasant movement. Earlier, the peasant movement were fighting only for the distribution of the land with the identity of peasants in the society. But we find that the peasant movement has got gradually transformed for the assertion of various kind of other kind of rights. I'll give two important examples. One example may come from northern part of Bengal, where the Tebaka movement took place. So here there was a process of inculcation, articulation of peasant as a marginalized category, and notwithstanding their affiliation to certain ethnic, caste or other kind of categories or religious categories. Now over a period of time, there has been since those issues of the peasants are not solved within the economic categorization, the marginal category or proletariat category, there has been articulation of the ethnic identities. Say Rajbangshi identity of the scheduled caste is articulated to assert for their identity within the wider zone of North Bengal, that has aspired for a statehood within the state. Like this. So what we find similarly in Andhra Pradesh, there has been a process of articulation of ethnic identities. Those were the identities of the peasant that took place during this Telangana movement. Gradually, the ethnic identity of Telangana state, within the state of Andhra Pradesh, it articulated. So what we find then also within that we find there is enormous proliferation of gender identity, enormous proliferation of the OBC, Madiga, Malla identities, the farmers' identities, the gender identities. So what we find, there has been enormous proliferation of identities, that is what we call proliferation of multiplicity of identity within that. So what we find, the peasant movement, those were founded on the old model of identity formation in terms of class, has got transformed into the formation of new social identities in terms of ethnicity, caste and gender. So what we find, social movement of the peasant movement as a variant of social movement is not necessarily has remained peasant movement per se. It has been diversified in the form of ethnic movement, caste movement and also articulation of the gender interest. The important part is that what has been the consolidation of interest within that each of those categories. Now we find that there has been assertion since the identities have not remained consolidated, because when we talk about identity, we find that identity a kind of a consolidated identity to take place, either in terms of class, in terms of caste or in terms of ethnicity. Now we find that there has been a kind of a formulation of even individual identities, individual assertion. And those individual assertion, those that critique the power, critique the dominant section of the society. The peasants critiquing of the dominant section of the society by distortion of the abbreviation, by articulating satire, forming the rhymes, at times making wits against the dominant categories. Those individual assertion also take place. So what we find, those articulation of identity, those who are at the collective level, now those are quietly getting diversified. The resistance is there, but may not be collective. Resistance becoming individualized, but getting linked through satire, rhymes, and etc. like this. So what we find, there in the alternative forms of collective identity formation. Those alternative forms are in terms of ethnicity, caste, gender, language, and also in terms of individual assertion of identities in the society. Now, if we have to look into how those were getting transformed, we have to look into autonomy of those identities. How those autonomies, how those identities are articulating autonomy within the wider framework. Because if resistance or the movements are to be articulated, they are guided by certain organization. Is it possible to get a space for those autonomous articulation? Here is a kind of interdependency between the what we call consolidation of identity at one end and deconsolidation of identity at another end. It is getting consolidated maybe at the at one end in the form of ethnicity, gender, and caste, also getting diluted in the name of or in the form of economic identities on the other. A kind of a mutual contrasting identity formation taking place in the peasant society. But overall, what has happened, all identities are getting encapsulated within the local realities and wider context. That is giving the shape of citizenship identity in our society. And this citizenship identity is quite important in that way. It is helping the peasant to develop the peasant praxis. What is the peasant praxis? Peasant praxis is a kind of a theory of action through ontology of their being and becoming in the peasant society. And this peasant ontology or peasant praxis is quite important in that way because peasant till now they remain victim of livelihood insecurity. Because they are the poverty ridden people living below the poverty line, they are the illiterate, they are the migrating from one part of the country to another, and also they are simultaneously self-asserting. And how they are self-asserting? They are self-asserting themselves through their connectivity. Now that connectivity, that space for connectivity, they have been evolved through prolonged period of negligence and victimhood they have suffered in the society, and they are making that a tool of their assertion through the democratic process of getting affiliated to one political party or the other. So what we find, there has been a process of articulation of peasant praxis within the wider democratic framework of the society, and that is providing the peasantry a kind of a scope, not the scope, a scope for the articulation of their discontent in the society. So what we have said in our lecture today, very precisely, we have tried to talk about what is the social movement, how the social movement are conceptualized in terms of certain fundamental features, that is in terms of its peasant movement is an organized action either for change or to resist change, and it is to be guided by an organization, leadership, interest articulation and a mobilization process. Also, movement is undergoing a process of change. We also simultaneously talked about how the peasant movement is conceptualized by the traditional functionalist scholar, the Marxist scholar, the symbolic interactionist scholar, collective theorist scholar, the resource mobilization, and also we talked about simultaneously identity perspective of movement studies. Then we tried to understand who are peasant. We have tried to understand peasant as a marginalized category in the society, and we have talked about they have remained marginalized, becoming victims of varieties of social, economic, political, and cultural deprivation in the society. Those are reproduced in varieties of the forms, and being marginalized, they have been the flag bearer of varieties of revolts and discontent in the society. Those are reflected in varieties of the peasant movement. We have also talked about how peasant movements have undergone change over a period of time from radical to reformative, and now when it has become reformative, it has changed from the old to the new movement, becoming diversified in its attitude. But even being diversified, they have articulated the praxis within the democratic framework of politicization and political interest articulation of their interest. Hope you have articulated certain question. Should we have some, you may post it in our Facebook. I'll be happy to answer and respond to all of your queries. Thank you for being with us.